going to spend a lot of time. I just want to introduce Michelle Henry, who is going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Taylor. Michelle Henry, of course, is the Chautauqua County historian, and it was her suggestion that we bring Dr. Taylor to to Dunkirk. Michelle?
Did you say who you were, James?
No.
That was James O'Brien, the president of the Chautauqua County Historical Society, who's co-sponsoring this wonderful event along with the Dunkirk Lighthouse Museum. And it was so nice of them to let us use their facility. It's a wonderful spot, so appropriate for a talk of this nature. And I'm going to just let Dave Briska from the Lighthouse say a few words before we introduce Dr. Taylor.
Hello. As a board member, I would like to thank Dr. Taylor and all of you for coming to our historic lighthouse. As a vital part of this community since 1826, the lighthouse is proud to be a part of this War of 1812 presentation. Since the first shots were fired off the western shore of Point Gratiot, it is very appropriate for Dr. Taylor to be here. Again, I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and on your way out, if you would stop in our store and sign our guest book, I would really appreciate that, since we are a not-for-profit organization.
To come down to Chautauqua County, so I sent him an email, totally, him not knowing me one bit, and just kind of threw it out there that if he was going to come to the Niagara University Conference, if he could see it in his heart to come to Chautauqua County, we would love to have him. And he immediately responded that he would be happy to do that. So I just think it's so fortuitous that we were able to bring him here. Dr. Taylor is a professor at the University of California at Davis. He's written numerous books related to American history. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. His latest book is The Civil War of 1812. A wonderful, wonderful book. I brought my own copy, which looks like it's been through the wash, but that's because I take it with me. I make notes, I scribble in it. We have these for sale today for anybody who's interested. Afterwards, if you'd like to take a look at one or buy one, Dr. Taylor would be happy to sign it for you. And afterwards, we'll have refreshments. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you all for being here.
You here?
Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. If I speak any louder, I'll blast you back. Okay. A few months ago, I was asked to speak in Philadelphia, and the organizers were very optimistic. So they arranged an auditorium with 900 seats in it, and 40 people showed up. They then arranged themselves randomly through the 900 seats. So you have outdone Philadelphia by about at least 2, if not 3 to 1. I want to thank Michelle for all that she's done to arrange this, and I'm going to try to explain why I've chosen the title of The Civil War of 1812. That's a bit of an unusual title, but I'm trying to persuade you that it fits, and that it helps us to think about that conflict in a different way. Now, when I speak to Americans, and I assume you're all reliable Americans, but you're kind of unreliable in that you probably know something about the War of 1812. Most Americans don't, because it's eclipsed by either the Revolution or the Civil War on either end of it. If Americans do know something about the war, they'll think, well, it wasn't all that important because it didn't change any boundary. And at best, they may recall the war for a handful of patriotic symbols and incidents. So the victories of the frigate USS Constitution, known as Old Ironsides, or the British nastiness in burning our White House and Capitol, and then the American success at Baltimore in defending that city, which inspired the Star-Spangled Banner. Or people will remember the payback taken at the Battle of New Orleans by Andrew Jackson and the Tennessee Riflemen against the British at the very end of the war. Thank you. See, I have the latest in technology. Now, all of these images suggest that what the war was is a defense of the United States against British invasion. A poor success most of the time. So Canadians like to remember what Americans forget. And they tell the story as the victory of the Canadian David over the American Goliath. And I can assure you, just having been in Toronto, that the first thing everybody wants me to know is that they won the War of 1812. Now, the book that I've written here tries not to take national sides. And what I'm trying to do is what I call a borderlands history. So I'm interested in people who lived along this broad border from Detroit on the west, through Lake Erie, and the Niagara River and Lake Ontario, and then down the St. Lawrence as far as Montreal. Because the peoples who lived on either side of the border in 1812 were remarkably similar people. Indeed, they were often related to each other. They moved back and forth readily, they traded with each other. In that world, it's a world before the automobile. It's before paved roads. People did not move readily overland. People moved by water, and goods did as well. So the worst possible place you could put a border, if you meant that border to separate people, was through a waterway. So the people who lived right here didn't feel isolated from Canada. It was easier to go and just go right across the lake to Canada than it was to go 10 miles inland, given the wretched nature of the roads at that time. So we have to think of these people living along these waterways as people who are essentially the same people. They are the same ethnic groups. They have intermarried. A lot of cases, the people living on the Canadian side had recently lived on the American side and had just moved over there. And so the people living in this broad borderland, this is a stretch that's 1,500 miles long, are people who aren't very keen for there to be a war. They don't hate the people on the other side. It's pretty inconvenient to have this border suddenly be a hot border between two political regimes that have resolved to be at war. So I'm not trying in the book to tell the story of the War of 1812 everywhere. So there certainly was fighting along Chesapeake Bay and on the Gulf Coast and in the high seas. And all of those dimensions of the war get short shrift in my book. I'm focusing on this borderland. But in that borderland, at least 3/4 of the conflict in the war occurred. Because the United States' prime strategy to win the war is to invade the province of Upper Canada, what is now Ontario. And the prime corridors by which they would invade were either from Detroit on the western end or along the Niagara Peninsula. And in order to achieve these invasions, they're trying to secure control of the Great Lakes, and in particular, Erie and Ontario. So the United States and the British will build quite substantial navies, especially on Lake Ontario. The largest warship that the United States had in its navy was built during the war on Lake Ontario, much larger than anything they had floating in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I call this a civil war, and let me try to give you some of the flavor of why I think it is a civil war. And to start with, almost all of the people fighting in the war spoke English. They spoke the same language. Now, there are, of course, exceptions, because both of these armies are multi-ethnic armies. There are German speakers, there are French speakers, there are Gaelic speakers on both sides. But the common language for the belligerents was English. So this is different than, say, when the English fight the French or when the French fight the Germans. It's a common language. People can use words to try to persuade one another to change sides. And there is a sense that they share a common culture. We have to bear in mind that this is just one generation removed from the American Revolution. And my argument is that the American Revolution isn't the kind of nice, clean, neat break that we tend to remember it as. That it's going to take people to change over time culturally. Most of the books and magazines that people would have read were either imported from Britain or they were pirated from Britain. People still live very much in an Anglo-American culture here as of the time of the War of 1812. And so in September of 1813, a British lieutenant was up on the Niagara Peninsula, and he was sent under a flag of truce into an American military camp to negotiate a prisoner exchange. So he gets into the camp, and he marveled upon meeting the enemy officers. For him, the enemy officers were American officers. And he said, "Strange indeed did it appear to me to find so many names, familiar household words, as enemies, the very names of officers in our own army. How uncomfortably like a civil war," end quote. Le Couture, this British officer, bantered with an American officer who was coming in from shooting birds. And Le Couture said to him, quote, "Much pleasanter sport, isn't it, than shooting one's own kindred and language," end quote. But a month later, an atrocity committed by some American troops led Le Couture to denounce them all as deserving no mercy in battle. Quote, "The rascals, they are worse than Frenchmen," end quote. That's about the worst thing a Brit could say about someone. But so said the British officer with a French name, John Le Couture. And it reminds us that these armies are multi-ethnic. Le Couture was from one of the Channel Islands, where most of the people, their first language was French, and their last names were French. But they considered themselves loyal to the British Empire. British Empire wasn't simply British. It's not simply English. It includes Scots and Welsh and Channel Islanders and the Irish. And it includes the people of Quebec, French speakers. It includes a variety of English and German speakers who have ended up settled in Upper Canada. And it includes some peoples of India and peoples of Africa and West Indian peoples. It's like all empires, it's multi-ethnic, just as the United States was multi-ethnic. Now, language is the predominant, English, is the predominant language, but there are all sorts of people who are not of English descent living in the United States by then. Now, in this North American Civil War, brother sometimes literally did fight brother. At Kingston, up on the other side of Lake Ontario, Le Couture lodged with a Mrs. Elizabeth Robinson. And he wrote, quote, "They are a Yankee family and have several relatives in the American Army and Navy," end quote. Another British officer reported that a Canadian soldier of the Glengarry Light Infantry shot an American rifleman and then rushed up to plunder the corpse, which was common practice on both sides, particularly among the light infantrymen and the riflemen. So he rushes up to this corpse when, quote, he discovered that it was his own brother, end quote. He then coldly remarked, quote, that it served him right for fighting for the rebels when all the rest of his family fought for King George, end quote. I want to remind you, this is an episode that occurred in 1813, not in 1776. This is a generation after the American Revolution. But for these people, the revolution is still ongoing. It's not finished. People are still making choices, particularly in Upper Canada, as to whether or not they support a Republican revolution or whether they still prefer the mixed constitution of Britain, the unity of the empire, and the rule of King George. It's the same King George who is ruling, although he is not all there mentally. I'd be doing great if I had a third hand. Now, to call the War of 1812 a civil war now seems jarring because for so long we've treated it as a war between two nations that were radically different already, Britain and the United States. And so I've tried to make the case that they weren't that radically different, that there's a lot of overlap in culture and in ethnicities, and that there's still an open possibility that people can shift sides. And so no one was confident that the boundary was going to stay fixed through this conflict. Many people in Canada feared that the United States would triumph and the border would move well north and take in Upper Canada into the United States. And therefore the people living there feel compelled to make choices. Are they going to resist this expansion of the United States, or are they going to assist that expansion? And people divided in their choices. And that's the experience of Civil War. Most of the people who lived in Upper Canada in 1812 were not from Britain, and they weren't French, and they hadn't been in Upper Canada very long. They were recently arrived settlers from the United States. Some of those people had come in as true loyalists, refugees from the American Revolution during the 1780s, right at the end of the Revolution. But most of them were known as late loyalists. And they were people who had moved in there in the 1790s in the first decade of the 19th century. Those late loyalists comprised at least 60% of the population of Upper Canada when the war broke out. They were not called Canadians. The word Canadian in 1812 was only applied to French-speaking people. What were they called? They were called Americans. They were Americans and they lived in Upper Canada, and they were a majority of Upper Canada's population. So these are the people who are having to make some hard choices when an army shows up from their former country saying, you should help us. And meanwhile, the governors of their colony that has given them essentially free land is saying, no, you must defend the province against these invaders. And people divided. Now, what most people wanted to do was just stay home on their farm and not get shot at or do any shooting. But as the war goes on, it becomes harder and harder to just stay on your farm, and people have to make choices. Now, on the American side of the border, the war begins in large part because there's so much insecurity about having the British Empire as your next door neighbor. Americans believed, or at least the governing party of the country at that time, which was the Republican Party of James Madison, which is not the same party as the Republican Party of today. But the Republican Party of 1812 was governing the country, controlled Congress, controlled most of the state governorships and legislatures, and the president, James Madison, was a Republican. Now, they greatly feared the British in Canada because they believed that the British were up to no good. They believed that they were using British as a base to intrigue through spies with the opposition party in the United States, the Federalists. Now, the Federalists were deeply distrusted by the Republicans. This is not two-party politics or any kind of bipartisanship. At that time, each of the parties insisted that it alone represented the true will of the American people, and the other party was indeed a set of conspirators against the Republic. So it was routine for the Republicans to say that the Federalists of 1812 were Tories, and that they were in cahoots with the British, and that they wanted to destroy the Republic and introduce the British system, including a king, to the United States. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying the Federalists actually believed any of that. But that's what the Republicans said about the Federalists, and it's what they believed about the Federalists. And people act on their beliefs. So there's bitter divisions within the United States, and there's the perspective of the Republicans running the country that the Federalists are secretly plotting with the British in Canada to destroy the American Republic and its union. There's also a great deal of anxiety about the British alliance with Indian peoples. The British had the policy of providing ammunition and guns to native peoples living all around the Great Lakes, within the United States, as well as in Canada. Now, they were doing this as kind of a contingency plan, because they think the day may come when there will be a war with the United States again, and they want the help of those Indians living in places like Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois. So they're trying to sustain the independence of those Indian peoples by helping them to resist American settler expansion westward. Now, the British think of this, they're doing this semi-covertly. They're doing it to retain these people as allies for the future. And they regard it as a defensive measure. But you can well imagine how James Madison and the Republicans would think about this. To have a foreign power sending guns and ammunition into people who are fighting your settlers along the frontier would be perceived as an act of aggression. So, in the years running up to 1812, there's a great deal of insecurity by the government of the United States about whether the Republic could survive if the British remain as the next door neighbors to the American Republic. Just as there's a lot of anxiety in Canada about American intentions to expand. And it's a classic kind of conflict where everybody is reading the other side's actions in the worst possible light, and they tend to gin themselves up to a fever pitch where war will erupt. And so it's a situation where the leaders on both sides could imagine as possible that the people living within their boundaries could switch sides. Particularly for the Republicans, they thought that the Federalists, who were strongest in New England, were quite tempted to secede from the Union and to enter a new association with the Empire. Now, this kind of scenario was not particularly well along among the Federalists, but the Republicans believed that it was. Now, I mentioned the migration of Americans into Upper Canada, and so that's one of the phenomena that is increasing the overlap of these people. Another is the migration of Irish people into the United States. Between 1783 and 1820, 2/3 of the immigrants coming into the United States came from Ireland. And most of them are coming after 1798. In 1798, there was a very bloody rebellion in Ireland that the British suppressed with great brutality. And it creates a lot of refugees. And if you're a highly politicized person from Ireland, you're committed to a republican form of government rather than the monarchy of Britain, where are you going to go in the world if you've got to get out of Ireland? You're going to go to the United States. And these people came and they were very politically active. A fair number of them were editors of the most influential newspapers in the United States, and newspapers were highly politicized. And these people beat the drum early and often for having a war against the British Empire. They see this as an opportunity for some payback if they can take Canada away from the British. Now, the presence of so many Irish people in the United States also becomes another catalyst for the war. One of the causes of the war, other than the problems along the frontier, another problem, a set of problems had to do with the maritime rights of American ships and sailors. And the British had the largest navy in the world, the most powerful navy in the world, and they felt they needed it. After all, they're an island country, the homeland, and they've got a very powerful enemy just across the English Channel, in the French Empire being run by the dictator Napoleon Bonaparte, who was at the peak of his power in 1812, dominating the rest of the continent. And so the British have this huge navy, and yet their homeland is relatively lacking in population. How are they going to have enough sailors for this big navy to operate these ships? Particularly because so many of these sailors want to get out of the Royal Navy by escaping to the United States and entering service in the American Merchant Marine, where the pay was better, the food was far better, and you didn't get whipped nearly as often, and you were in much less danger of people shooting at you. Because the United States was, prior to 1812, a neutral country in this world at war. And as a neutral country, it's in the position to scoop up all of this international trade in these ships that had become too dangerous for the belligerents, the French and the British. So the British are very upset about this. See, the Americans getting rich, taking away their sailors, using them on their ships, and rendering the Royal Navy short-handed at a time when the British believed, quite accurately, that they're fighting for the survival of their empire. So they would stop these ships in the high seas, American merchant ships, American flags, and they would say, okay, we're going to inspect your crews now. He looks British to me, he looks British, he sounds like he's Irish to me. I'm sure he's from Quebec. You're all in the Royal Navy. Take him off, leaving the ship short-handed. Now, in most cases, these people probably had, once upon a time, lived in the British Empire, but it might have been a very long time ago. And they thought they'd been naturalized as American citizens. British say, no. Once you are born a British subject, you remain a British subject all of your life. You can never change it. We don't care what other mumbo-jumbo some other country may do. You are still a British subject. So don't show me those American citizenship papers. They're worthless. I can tell you're from Cornwall, so you are in the Royal Navy. And of course, a British naval officer who's short-handed in his crew is just going to help himself to whoever looks like an able-bodied seaman. And a fair number of these people are, in fact, people who were born in the United States. As you can imagine, this creates a lot of ill will, and the Republican administrations of the United States make it a major issue, and it will help to bring on the war. When that war does come, the American army sent to invade Canada will have a disproportionate number of Irish American soldiers in their ranks. Now, I don't mean a majority, I just mean a larger proportion of the rank and file soldiers than the proportion of Irish Americans in the population at large. In other words, Irish Americans were more apt to enlist in this war than were the general run of Americans. We can think about why that might be. Immigrants tend to be poorer people. Serving in the American military has been for many immigrant groups, then as now, an opportunity to claim a place in American society. Plus, these are people who are highly motivated. They hate the British, much more than most Americans hated the British. Now, when they cross over as American invasion forces into Canada, some of the battles go very badly, and they end up being captured. How will the British treat these Irish Americans? Remember that the British think of somebody who's born a subject as always a subject. So that means this Irish American soldier wearing the American uniform, just captured, has been captured fighting against his king, which means he's a traitor. So the British would also inspect all the prisoners they had just taken. And if anybody seemed to be Scots or Welsh or Irish, they were pulled out and they were given a choice. The choice was, you can now enlist in the British Army, or you can be tried as a traitor and you will be hung. Now, most people make the choice that I think most of us would make under those circumstances, which is, I'll enlist. And of course, we'd probably be thinking, when's the next chance I can run away and get back to the United States and resume shooting these people? Right? But in this one battle, not too far from here, over in Queenston Heights, there were 23 Irish Americans who said, no, you're going to have to put me on trial. So they were taken and they were sent to England. Now this causes a crisis, a political crisis in the United States, because the support of Irish Americans for the Republican Party was essential to the electoral fortunes of that party. And the enlistment of Irish Americans was essential to the military success of the United States in this war. If Irish Americans stop enlisting because they think, well, if I get captured, I'm going to get hung, then the United States is not going to have nearly enough soldiers. So the United States decides, okay, the only thing we can do is to retaliate. We're going to take 23 British officers whom we've captured, set them aside, and we tell the British, for every American soldier that you hang, we're going to hang one of your captured officers. And when you look at the list of these 23 British officers who were being held hostage, most of them were Irish. Because the regiments that were defending Upper Canada in the first 2 years of the war had mostly been recruited in Ireland. So one of the prime reasons why the British are so insistent upon punishing captured Irish Americans is they're worried about the discipline and the cohesion of their own Irish soldiers. They don't want their own Irish soldiers to have these Americans seemingly to get away with their apparent treason. Because if their own Irish soldiers get to see this, they're going to think, maybe I should be running away and go to the other side. So the British are making a point of this, but what it means is that the United States government is holding a certain set of Irish men as hostage for the fate of another set of Irish men, because Irish were fighting on both sides in this war. So for these Irish people, it's a civil war. These are people who in many cases knew each other before. And you're asking, well, why would any Irish person enlist and serve in the British Army? Well, the more prosperous classes, this is a way upward to get an officer's commission. And so these men who are being held hostage by the Americans, these officers, are people who are of a higher class and are probably mostly Protestant Irish. And in the ranks, you've got all these poor, mostly Catholic Irish serving in the British Army, and they do so because they're desperate. Ireland was a desperately poor country where starvation was routine. So there are a lot of people who are getting fed regularly and clothed, and that's what the army means to them, even though it's the army of their oppressor. Now, so what's going to happen next? It turns out the British had won most of the battles in Canada, so they had many more prisoners than the Americans had. So they said, fine, you've set aside 23, we're going to set aside 46. And if you hang any one of our officers, we're going to hang 2 of yours. So you know what the United States will next do. They will set aside 46 more. And the British say, fine, 92. And they kept doing this until the prisoners on both sides were being held hostage for ultimately the fate of these 23. So that if any of these original 23 had been convicted and hung, it could have set off this cascading bloodbath that would have killed virtually all the prisoners on both sides. Now, the truth is that neither side really had the stomach for this, because both of them hopes to make peace someday, and that's going to be pretty hard if they've engaged in all these executions of prisoners. Now, finally, I just want to mention something about Native American experience. It's also one of Civil War. There are Native peoples of the same nations who end up divided by the war, and principally the Haudenosaunee peoples. They're also sometimes called the Iroquois. The Senecas, for example, who are very familiar to you. Of course, they were Seneca who were living in Buffalo Creek, who were active in American forces in the 2nd and 3rd years of the war. But they are fighting against Haudenosaunee people who lived over on the Canadian side at Grand River, including some Senecas. And so, particularly in the Battle of Chippewa in July of 1814, they are pitted in combat against each other and they kill one another. And there are other examples of this with other Native peoples in this war, as both the Americans and the British are doing their best to coerce Native peoples to be their allies and to fight against the other side, but that means they end up fighting against Native peoples, and in many cases their own relatives on the other side. So let me conclude now. I've tried to make the case that this was a North American Civil War, in which Americans fought Americans, especially in Upper Canada, in which the Irish battled the Irish, and in which some Native peoples attacked one another. Before the war, the political regimes on both sides of the border suspected that the continent was not big enough for their rival systems. The Republic on the American side and the mixed constitution on the other. One or the other, it seemed, would have to prevail in the house divided. So like the Revolution, the War of 1812 was a civil war between very similar peoples with competing visions of what North America should be. Should it still be loyal to the empire? Or should it be defined by its Republican revolution against that empire and its institutions? But neither side would reap what it expected from this war. The Republic would survive, but so would British North America. Both sides were frustrated in their early fantasies of smashing the other. And so the Loyalist America and the Republican America, meaning Canada and the United States, would have to learn how to share the continent, and then for each of them to call coexistence victory. Oh, I began this talk with the common belief that the War of 1812 lacked consequences because it seemed to end in a draw. But I want to suggest a paradox. It was exactly because it was fought to a standoff that the war concluded the era of the American Revolution and compelled both sides to learn how to live within their borders. In sum, the War of 1812 had the greatest of consequences for North America. Thank you. So I'm happy to take any questions you have. Yes?
Where were the French Canadians in this war?
Okay. The French Canadians were in French Canada. No, but they were in Quebec mostly, but there were some that were in Windsor. But I take your point as a very good one. What sort of political choices did they make in the war? Which is a very good point. Mostly they of course don't like British rule, but when they have to think about, well, would we like being ruled by the Americans more? And their answer is no. They thought of the Americans as mostly a bunch of hyper-Protestant zealots. The Catholic Church was very powerful in Quebec. It had made peace with the British because the British treated the Catholic Church and its priests and bishops pretty well. And then those priests and bishops did work pretty hard to persuade the common people of Quebec that defending the British Empire was the way to go. And so the French Canadians aren't ordinarily in the forefront of the war because most of the American invasion effort went against Upper Canada, now Ontario, and bypassed Lower Canada, now Quebec. But whenever American forces did go up near Montreal, the French Canadians turned out and fought very hard and very well against the American invaders. Yes?
I read your book last fall, and there were two things in it that struck me. I thought I knew a little bit about the War of 1812, but there were two things that really surprised me. One was the degree and the frequency of the brutality in some of these encounters. Back and forth, right up here.
Right.
Things that would be considered atrocities, I
Right.
imagine even then.
Right.
I had no idea there was that much of it.
Right.
And the second thing was that it seems like all three of the national interests, Canada, Britain, and us, used their own native troops almost as terroristic weapons against the other.
Right.
Each of them was terrified of the other guy's Indians.
Yes.
Because they were out for blood too all the time, and they weren't nice about it in any way.
Well, the white people weren't very nice to the Indians either when they would capture them. So
Right.
it's neither side's giving much quarter when it's native peoples on one side and non-native peoples on the other.
Right. And they literally used the natives' reputations
Yeah,
against.
that's a very good point. The British are particularly good at this. They understand that Americans are fearful of Indians. They've got this image of Indians as these scalping savages. And so when you take these raw, undisciplined new recruits, these people had virtually no training. There wasn't any boot camp for the soldier in the War of 1812. You're pretty much, as soon as you're enlisted, you're marched to the front. And along the way, they're trying to teach you the rudiments of the military life. And then you're taking these guys that a month or 2 months before had been on the farm, And they got uniforms on and they got guns, but that's the only thing that's much different. And then you're herding them to the front, and they're out there, and the front is woods mostly. It's a heavily forested landscape with pockets of farms. And then they hear Indians screaming. And then they see Indian warriors who are very good at painting themselves for maximum effect. Because they know that, you know, part of war is to work up your own courage and to try to deflate the courage of the other. And they're very good at this. They've developed this over many generations. They're masterful at this forest warfare. And then you get these people who are farm boys. You know, these aren't Daniel Boone. These are farm boys from New England and eastern New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia who are going up there. So a lot of them got really spooked by this and would just run away. And the British figured this out, and the native peoples figured it out, and they play it up even more. There's this theatrical element to it. But there's also real brutality when they would get their hands on people from the other side. People from Kentucky who were adapted to Indian warfare give as well as they get in this scalping and brutal treatment of prisoners. So the British always said, well, why are you always after us about how we use Indians and their scalping? You got Kentuckians, and they scalp. So when you stop enlisting Kentuckians, we'll stop using Indians as allies. So as you can imagine, that doesn't get anyone any farther. Yes?
I have two questions. One you may want to dismiss, I hope not. But I notice you refer in contemporary literature on the War of 1812, refer to the Republicans and the Federalists as the two political parties in the United States. Well, 50 years ago when I was studying history, American history in college, and reading Hollinger's work, they were identified as Democrat Republicans.
Right.
And I wonder, when did they drop the Democrat?
Well, you see, that name Democratic Republican is really something that scholars put on them in the early 20th century. So what's happened is that scholars more recently have said, well, what did Jefferson and Madison call themselves? They did not call themselves Democratic Republican. They called themselves Republicans. Scholars have reverted back to the usage of the time. But the danger when you do that is it seems like, well, this is the same continuous Republican Party to the present, and the current Republican Party institutionally goes back to just the 1850s.
The other question I have is, as I understand it, much of the army, the federal army, in the first 2 years of the war were made up of militia units.
Right.
Who were quite reluctant even to cross borders on
Right.
an offensive.
Right.
So it suggests to me that perhaps they were aware of who they were fighting, and they really didn't want to fight.
Well, the American forces are quite a mixture of types of units. There are regular Army units, but it turns out most of these regular Army units have just recently been recruited, because the American Army was about 6,000 men in the professional Army when this war began, which isn't nearly enough to guard the seaports, patrol the West against Indian peoples, and invade Canada. I mean, you're going to need a force, they figured out in the course of the war, of about 50,000 men to take on all these assignments. In year one,
Records, casualty records, naval records,
most of them are for the United States are at the U.S. National Archives.
and for the British.
For the British, you can find in British National Archives in London, or they've got microfilm of just about all of them at the Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa. Now, some of the records, say, for casualties are not as complete as we would like, but the records for enlistment are pretty good. And so they can be a great resource, particularly for people who are trying to figure out their family connections back in that period. Yes?
Yeah, you may have alluded to the answer to this question in the very first sentence when you talked about this war falling between the War for Independence and the Civil War.
Right.
But I asked my friends who said, what are you doing today? Last week. I said, I'm going to a lecture on the War of 1812. None of them knew what the causes of the war
Right.
was. None of them knew any of the battles in the
Right.
war, and none of them knew any of the results.
Well, see, they should have come today.
But since they didn't come, would it be fair to say that?
But you're going to tell them when you go back.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That this was.
Buy them all a copy of the book. Do we have enough copies for all his friends?
This is really a forgotten
Yes.
forgotten war in
Yes.
American history.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to get him first and then you. Okay, I promised him that he would go next.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Go ahead.
If I can skip ahead just a few years,
How many?
maybe 35.
35, that's a lot of
Well,
years.
it's going to go back in history. That's a short
Okay.
amount of time.
Okay.
Resentment lasts a long time.
Mm-hmm.
When America had their Civil War in the 1860s,
Right.
did the British Empire ever entertain the thought of trying to recapture America or get?
No, they don't entertain that thought. And one of the reasons why they don't is because of the battle in New Orleans, which went so badly for them. So a lot of people will tell you, if they know anything about the battle of New Orleans, they'll say, oh, it was fought after the peace. Didn't matter. Just made Andrew Jackson president. It did make Andrew Jackson president. The rest of it's not true. The peace doesn't come until mid-February. There's a peace treaty, but it's provisional until it gets ratified for the two sides. So the Battle of New Orleans happened while the war was still going on, a month before the war actually ended. And it's significant because it's so one-sided, and it has this powerful psychological effect on British policymakers, that they know it's never going to be possible for them to send a major army deep into the United States and win a battle.
Even during
and
the
break
Civil-
up. But I'm coming to your Civil War.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm a long-winded academic.
Okay.
We come to the Civil War. The Civil War, the British have pretty much given up on trying to break up the United States because they find they can do such good business with the United States. It's the number one importer of British manufactured goods. The British economy depends on the American market. And the United States provides most of the cotton to Britain for its textile factories, which are a major industry. And it also provides most of the wheat that people need to live. So when a civil war comes along, it's complicated for the British because they want to not honor the Union blockade because they want the cotton to come through. On the other hand, they can't really afford to alienate the Union because they need the wheat to keep coming through. And they don't really want to have a war in Canada, but there's one point where there's a diplomatic incident, the Trent incident, which leads both sides right to the verge of war, and the British do rush a lot of troops over to Canada. So you're quite right, it does lead to this crisis, but it's not one where the British really have ambitions of splitting up the U.S. because it's deeply complicated for them. Yes, you have a question?
Yes. How involved were the American Revolutionary War veterans
Right.
in the War of 1812? Do you have those?
Well, the people who had been quite young in the Revolution are people who could serve again. But for most of the people who have been veterans of the Revolution, they're kind of beyond military service. The problem is, particularly in the first year of the war, most of the top officers in the American Army are people who were veterans of the Revolution and are physically not up to the challenges of service, particularly in Canadian conditions. Also, they'd mostly been junior level, they'd all been junior level officers during the Revolution. None of the general officers are either alive or capable of commanding. George Washington is long dead. The guys who are the veterans are people like William Hull, who's a guy in his late 60s and had been a junior officer and been a brave and capable junior officer. But it's one thing to take a guy who'd been a captain in a previous war and then make him a general in the next war when he's in his late 60s. And this was a pretty common phenomena among the American commanders, which is one of the prime reasons why things went so badly. Yes?
Personal question for you. Congratulations on the award of Pulitzer Prize. That's such an accomplishment. I'd be curious if you'd comment on life before and after being awarded a Pulitzer Prize.
Well, after winning it, people think I'm a lot smarter than I was before. And people have a lot more ideas of things that I could do or universities I could work at than was the case before I won it, which always amuses me because I guess it's naive. I think I'm basically the same person as I was before, but kind of changes everything around you in a way, at least among those people who know about it. Lots of people that, 99.9% of the people I encounter in my daily life have no clue that I won the Pulitzer Prize, and that's just fine. But it's that other 1/10 of 1% who do know that I want it, and then there's a different perception that they may have of me. Or they may think I'm an, now I'm an arrogant person. I don't know. Yes.
When the British Navy overwhelmed the Americans coming up the Patuxent when they went in and burned the White House, it seemed like that was the main emphasis of the war. When did it
Well,
shift
it's not.
to the Great Lakes?
It's not the. No. That happens later in the war. It's kind of the reverse. Okay, so the war begins with American forces invading Canada in 1812 and 1813, and they will continue to do so in 1814. But something changes in early 1814, which is Napoleon loses power. Because it turns out he'd been at his peak in 1812, then he invades Russia, bad decision. And then everything starts to collapse for him in 1813, and then he's out in the spring of 1814. And the British now have got all of these thousands of troops, very well trained, fighting against Napoleon in Europe. What are they going to do? Could they just send them home, demobilize them? Some, but mostly they say, let's send them over to North America and teach the Americans a lesson for declaring war on us when we were at our weakest. Now let them see what war is like with us at our strongest. And so it's in 1814 that the British suddenly they can add up on their side of the ledger a lot more troops, and they decide, what are we going to do with them? Well, one place is attack Washington, another is to attack eastern Maine, the other is to come down and attack Plattsburgh, New York, and then fourth you can go attack New Orleans. They say, let's do it all. But they divided their forces up for these different operations rather than concentrating. And so the Eastern Maine thing goes well for them. The Plattsburgh thing doesn't go well. Going against Washington, D.C. works very well until they get ambitious and they say, let's go to Baltimore too, and that goes badly. And then the New Orleans thing's a disaster. So it's the last year of the war that's very different. As experienced by Americans, and it's the last year of the war that Americans remember, and not the first two. But it's the first 2 years of the war that the Canadians remember very clearly. You had a question.
You mentioned a large ship on Lake Ontario.
Yes.
I was a crew member for 7 summers on the Brig Niagara on Lake Erie in the 90s.
Right.
And that ship was 400 tons and 185 feet long.
Okay, well imagine a ship that's 1,000 tons.
What?
1,000 tons.
What's the name of it?
It was the Superior, I think.
Okay, yes. That would be much larger.
Right. Yes.
Speaking to the 1%, 99%, 1% that know about you and your Pulitzer.
I said 1/10 of 1%.
Well, maybe it even breaks down that way. I was raised.
You are very special people, it turns out.
I was raised on the Niagara River. I'm back living on the Niagara River. I would guess of the people that I know, less than 1% of them have any idea about the War of 1812, the significance of the War of 1812. They might know about Oliver Hazard Perry, but beyond that, they don't know. My question to you is, why do you suppose that is, when so many people that in my area are quite knowledgeable, in some cases very knowledgeable, about the American Civil War and about the Revolutionary War? It seems to the majority of the people in my area who should have an interest in the War of 1812, they do not. Why do you think that is?
It's a good question. People have a certain number of synapses that they're willing to devote to historical memory. And then there aren't that many that they're willing to devote. Because there are a lot of other things you got to keep track of. You know, how the Yankees are doing. I devote a lot of my synapses to that. So people are going to pick and choose, and there's a lot more attention paid by the popular culture. If you go into a bookstore, that's dating me, because there aren't any bookstores anymore. But if you went into a bookstore when they still existed, you go into the history section, what are most of the books? How many of them are about the War of 1812? There might be a few, but there'll be 3 times as many about the Revolution, and there'll be 10 times as many about the Civil War. So these things feed on themselves as publishers crank these out and authors crank them out, and the public consumes them, and then most of whatever may appear. The History Channel actually used to show history, and when it would do, it would be mostly World War II, and then secondarily it would be the Civil War, and then there would be maybe occasionally the Revolution. I don't know that they ever did anything in the War of 1812. So there are ways in which the culture kind of replicates kind of the core topics that are perceived, that are essential to American identity. And that would be the Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II. And the rest of it gets short shrift.
Our PBS in this area has had several very good programs on the War of 1812.
Right, I would say nothing good except good things about PBS in this area, yes. But they're kind of playing catch up now, because as many of you have noted, your neighbors mostly don't know that the War of 1812 was important, and that it happened in their backyard.
Could
Yes.
you use a zippier name?
We could. Could you come up with one? We could do some market research here. In Canada, they do call it the War of American Aggression, but I don't think that would market very well on this side. Yes?
Colonel Winfield Scott and General Brown, they did some very good fighting along that.
They did, yes. So by the end of the war, you get some better American officers rising to the top. And it's a parallel to what happened in the American Civil War, where the Union generals were so crappy early in the war, and then they get weeded out, and by the end you get some superb men. And the same thing happened among the U.S. officer corps toward the end of the war. You get some more professional officers rising to the top. Yes?
Could you comment on the role of Fort Niagara?
Role of Fort Niagara. Well, the role of Fort Niagara is very important because it controls the mouth of that river, and it's right next door to Fort George on the British side, and the town of what was then called Newark. It's now Niagara on the Lake. So it's a prime example in which this war is dividing communities that were used to people going back and forth all the time. The British actually found out about the declaration of war before the American garrison at Fort Niagara did. So some of their officers were over-socializing in Niagara on the Lake when Isaac Brock, the British commander, learns about the declaration of war and has them arrested. And it wasn't unusual for them. The officers were visiting back and forth all the time, and people were going back and forth. So to have the war that close between this fort and this village on the other side and the fort on the other side is very tense for much of the war until the British came in a night attack and surprised and captured Fort Niagara in December of 1813. And they will hold it for the rest of the war. So that's something that a lot of people don't know, is that the British captured Fort Niagara and held on to it. The Americans were never able to muster a counterattack to reclaim Fort Niagara. Yes?
When I went to Canada and talked about the burning of the Capitol that the British did, very cruel and brutal, they came back and said, before that, the Americans burned down Niagara on the Lake. Was the burning of the White House in retaliation for that?
Okay, well, there are a lot of things burning in Canada during the war, and American troops are responsible for most, but not all, the things being burned. And they included the Parliament buildings of York, what's now Toronto. So the Americans captured it in April of 1813. The troops got out of control and started looting pretty wildly, and then they set fire to the Parliament buildings. So the government didn't order it, but it happened, and they never punished any soldiers or sailors for having done it. And then in December of 1813, an American commander on that front ordered the burning of the village of Niagara on the Lake. So when the British then announced a policy of retaliation against American villages and cities along the Atlantic seaboard, and the first place where they're able to apply that policy was in Washington, D.C. And they applied it selectively. So sometimes people will say, well, the British burned down Washington. Then, no. 98% of the structures in Washington were left alone. But the 2% mattered a whole lot because they included the White House and the Capitol and the Navy Yard. So the British were selective about it, but they're trying to make a point, which is, you guys burn in Canada, and we're going to burn when we get our hands on stuff that you have.
They burned Youngstown.
Yes, they did burn Youngstown. That was in December of 1813. And they also burned Buffalo. So there was a lot of burning back and forth during this war. Yes?
So if this is a civil war, in your opinion, who won?
Well, you know, this is a question they wanted to ask of me in Toronto. And it turns out, because I'm being filmed, I have to give the same answer in both places. If we end the war with the Treaty of, or the day before the Treaty of Peace, then the British-Canadian side won, in that they defended Upper Canada successfully, and they captured a big part of northern Michigan, and they captured eastern Maine, and they had a strong position in Chesapeake Bay. But if we end it with the peace treaty, it turns out the United States won a remarkably good peace treaty given the military situation in December of 1814, and it was because the British wanted out of the war. And so they just said, we'll give you the pre-war boundaries, we'll withdraw our troops. Now, if you then cut forward to, let's say, 1816, it's clear by 1816 the United States won the war. Okay. Now, why would they be? Why would I say? Well, they lost the war as of December of 1814, but they won it by 1816, because I think we've got a narrow view of how wars work and how peace treaties work. We think peace treaties, as everybody agrees to what they mean. Peace treaties are how people behave in the wake of those peace treaties. The Americans behaved very aggressively, and they cut off the British from their Indian allies during 1815 and 1816. They put forts deep into Indian country. They started a process of accelerating the dispossession of Indian peoples and the settlement of Michigan, so that during that 2-year period, they're basically calling the bluff of the British, saying, you want another war? Okay, you're going to come and defend your Indian allies. They don't say that. The president doesn't say that, because that's not what presidents are supposed to do. But that's what the behavior of their officers along the Great Lakes is conveying. And the British officers along the Great Lakes are really upset because the Indians are complaining to them. And they say to their superiors in London, we got to help these people out. They helped us out in the war. And the government in London says, no. Trade with the United States, peace with the United States, paying down our national debt, not having another war. That's what matters. You abandon the Indians. And so it means that the United States is very aggressively able to maximize the benefits it receives from the Treaty of Ghent. So that what had been kind of a nebulous border zone of Michigan, Wisconsin, the upper Great Lakes, passes clearly into American control. And that's the green light for American expansion to the Pacific, and the United States becomes the dominant power in North America, and in the next century will become a superpower. So who won a war is not a simple question of who wins the most battles. It's who wins the peace that comes out of the war.